this will be pretty high level stuff. We'll get into a little bit of the novels in specific, but I think for me, it's just kind of fun talking to another writer, especially someone who does something so radically different from my own kind of writing, right? Screenplay versus novels are wildly different animals.
Sure.
Which I don't know how much you know about F. Scott Fitzgerald. Or Scott Fitzgerald. Yeah, and so he struggled for years, trying to write a screenplay. Meanwhile, had already written Gatsby, one of the great American novels.
Right.
And so, yeah, I have a lot of respect for what you do, and it's not what I do. And for me, one of the nice things about reading like your work or novels in general is it's escapism. Whereas, most people will go and watch a movie to escape, but for me, I can't help but I'm studying it. I'm trying to learn, whether it's the lighting or the writing. But for a novel, it's not at all what I do, and so I get to just kind of unwind my brain. But yeah, for my Patreon podcast subscribers, we are joined right now with Kevin Faulkner. He's an author, and I'm sure a bunch of other things. We're going to talk about his writing, career path, habits, his book that he just wrote, that I read, and all kinds of things. And so, Kevin, I really appreciate you hanging out for a bit.
Sure.
Awesome.
It's great.
And so, what is your background? What do you do for a living? What's your?
So, I have my education is mostly chemistry. Started out chemistry. I have a bachelor's and a PhD in chemistry, and I'm from the state of North Carolina, and that is where I mostly went to school. I went to undergrad at UNC Wilmington and to graduate school at Duke University, and then met my wife not at Duke. She was actually at UNC while I was at Duke, and she's a chemist also. And I followed her to Texas, and then after coming to Texas and moving here for a while, and living here for a while, I went to law school and became a patent attorney. And then after law school in Fort Worth, actually I went to the predecessor. It's now Texas A&M School of Law, but when I went at the time, it was Texas Wesleyan. Texas Wesleyan was bought out by Texas A&M in 2013, and so I'm now kind of an A&M alumni, but sort of by adoption. But when I was there, it was not Texas A&M, but it's still in the same place. But I worked at a law firm there in Fort Worth for a while as a patent attorney, and when you go into patent law, it's very specialized. I mean, patent law in itself is highly specialized. But even within patent law, you typically, a patent attorney will tend to work on things that you're technically capable of working on. And in fact, in order to even qualify to take the patent bar exam, you have to have at least an undergraduate degree in some sort of engineering or science. And mine was in chemistry. And so when I practiced patent law, I did a lot of chemical related patent work. And that's how I started. I did some basic mechanical stuff too. And even towards the end, I did a lot of mechanical things. And I think every patent attorney cuts their teeth on at least simple mechanical things. But I specialized in chemical type of patent work. So anyway, I worked in a law firm for a couple of years until I found a job in the oil and gas industry down here in Houston. So I was in the Fort Worth area at the time. And my wife was actually a professor at Texas Women's University, and which is up in Denton. And so we moved down here, and I started working at ExxonMobil and worked in-house there for 20 years, and as a patent attorney and as a general attorney too. So I did patent law, but I did a lot of other general law, contract work, licensing work, different times of legal work and intellectual property in general. Really, it's just patent strategy, intellectual property strategy type of work. And I did that for 20 or so years and just retired a few months ago.
Oh, wow.
But and right now, and just in retirement, I may look for some work. I'll probably look for some work here eventually. I'm not in any big rush, but right now, just enjoying retirement. A lot of folks, frankly, are retiring from ExxonMobil right now, and they're going through I think a downsizing, definitely.
Wow.
But but anyway,
Yeah.
so right now I'm retired is where I'm at.
Very cool. How long have you been writing? Is that something that started as a child, or is it something you developed in
It
college?
did. It started really as a child, even when I was very young, just writing little short stories, and I was pretty focused on science fiction, even from a young age too. And I will mention that I got early on, I got some encouragement. Now, nobody else in my family is interested in science fiction, but somehow or another, a family friend, someone who knew an adult, who knew my parents, kind of took me under their wing some about science fiction and introduced me to some things. And in fact, I thought I would pull it out. He gave me, it's this guy named Bob. He gave me this book, which is one of the few things I've kept from my childhood. I was just like 10 years old when he gave me this, but this is probably a 1970, 71 edition of Dune, and one of the first big novels I'd ever read. And on top of that, so I was living in Greensboro, North Carolina at the time. It just so happens that Gene Roddenberry came to the Greensboro Coliseum, and he took me as a child to go see Gene Roddenberry. And so Gene Roddenberry, of course, he took some time to speak to the audience, and also they showed the pilot episode of Star Trek. And at the time, this was like the mid, I guess it was the mid 70s, and the reruns of Star Trek were very popular, and they were very inspiring to me. And I loved them and loved the books. I read the Star Trek novels, then really got into that, really enjoyed the whole Star Trek world. And then of course, Star Wars came out when I was a little older, and I was a young boy, just 13 years old, I think, when the first Star Wars movie came out. And that was, to put it mildly, kind of life-changing, especially for somebody, me into science fiction as it was. And so anyway, there were some early things there that, on top of my interest in writing, it really inspired my curiosity in science fiction writing. Between Dune, reading this, and I'll tell you the truth, when I first read this, I was just 10 to 11 years old. I really didn't even fully appreciate it. It's kind of a high level. This is a pretty mature novel, really. In fact, looking back on it, I'm thinking, I don't even know if it's appropriate for a 10-year-old, but it's a pretty high level science fiction, and a lot of mature themes, frankly, in the book. And but nonetheless, though I really got into science fiction, but I didn't really write seriously for a long time. But what happened is that the Texas Bar Journal, being serving the legal community, a lot of attorneys enjoy writing. There's a lot of famous attorneys, in fact, who are famous authors, and they held a short story contest once a year. And so I started to enter it about what's been 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, that I started entering it. And the first stories I wrote for them, they weren't science fiction. In fact, out of the 6 or 7 stories that I entered into the contest, only one was science fiction, which is the one that matured into the novel that I've now published. But initially, it was just little short stories, fictional short stories that I wrote. And then the only rules were of the short story contest were that the word count couldn't be any more than 2,000 words, which is a very short story. And it had to be fictional, and there had to be some element of legal law, the law and law work. And so with that as a backdrop, I wrote some different kinds of fictional work. But the third or fourth story that I wrote was the short story that this novel matured from, and went through a lot of iterations. And I started it really, I submitted that short story in about 2017, and but then decided to pick it up and expand on it around 2018 maybe. And initially my goal was really just to write a longer short story, basically something more in the 10,000 to 15,000 word length. And I was going to submit it to just some sort of a journal, an online magazine or journal for publication. But it just kept growing. I got some real editorial help for the first time. I actually, went online and found some professional editors, and got some guidance and help. And it just gradually grew into what it ended up publishing into.
Yeah. So I can't remember if Song told me this or if I read it as part of, your acknowledgments, but you are part of a writing group. And so I'm curious, how did you get plugged into it? How did it form?
Well,
How often
no,
did you meet?
no, I'm not part of a writing group.
Okay.
I hired an editor who was part of a writing group. I mean,
Um,
an editor group, and I found them online and called them and talked to them. They were part of a professional editing group, and and you contact them individually and hire them, and that's how I got hooked into that. I mean, but I'm not really part of that group.
so what does that process look like? Are you sending them your manuscript and they're giving you notes about pacing, story ideas, on a practical
Yeah.
level? What's that relationship kind of look like on a week-to-week basis?
So I contacted them. I would contact an individual. So on the way that this group work, I think it's the independent editors group. I mean, they have individual editors that you can read a little bit of blurb about them and what they kind of specialize in. Frankly, as an aside, it's actually difficult to find someone who specializes in science fiction. In fact, a lot of people, when I would talk to them, they would even say, "I don't do science fiction." They'll do just about anything else but science fiction. It was interesting. The
Why
whole
is that?
process. I mean, when I first started this, I mean, it's the whole thing has been quite a learning experience. But I think a lot of people, a lot of writers and editors are intimidated by science fiction.
Mm,
And frankly, it's the funny thing in the legal world. It's almost there's a parallel. My experience in the legal world is that lawyers are intimidated by patent lawyers, and it's because I mean, I think a lot of people are intimidated by science and engineering, uh, and likewise, if you're into science fiction, there's a lot of at least fictional, science and engineering, and people that aren't knowledgeable or interested at all in science or engineering, or I think are intimidated by that. And I mean, that's my
mm,
read of why it is the way it is. But I did find it. I found one editor initially that gave me some real sort of broad guidance about, writing a novel, finding your character, finding an arc for that character, some very broad guidance. But he kind of fell to the wayside. He wasn't really interested in getting. I think he was just busy with other things. But he recommended another editor that I found, and I acknowledged her. Her name is Sally Artesiros. And so I talked to her on the phone some. And so what we did is exchanged. I would just draft, manuscripts and then send them to her. I believe I actually sent hard copies to her. She preferred that, so I would send a hard copy to her
so that she could mark it up.
She would literally mark it up and send it back. And the type of editing, and she even told me, she warned me that the type of editing she was going to do was going to be more what I would call first and second degree editing. I mean, just grammar, verb tense type of things,
Mm,
some broader things, taking care of issues where, I'm assuming the reader knows something, but they don't, and I need to explain it a little better. That was something early on that I found one of the biggest challenges is that in the writing process, when I'm writing, I mean, obviously I know what's in my head and I know what I want the story to be and what I want the characters to say and do. But the reader, of course, doesn't, and I have to
uh,
tell them. And sometimes I think as a writer, you can assume too much or just forget that the reader doesn't know certain things. And it was invaluable to have someone outside of me, an editor, looking at it and saying, "Hey, Kevin, the reader is not going to know this, or you're going to have to explain this a little more, that a little more." Although I didn't take all of her advice. There were some things in particular that I disagreed with on her, but for the most part, of course, I took her advice. And
so that's interesting because that's one of the crucial points. I don't know if you've ever seen Million Dollar Baby. It's about a boxer, right? And
yeah,
this woman who really is just passionate about it, and she goes to Clint Eastwood, and but at a certain point towards the beginning of the film, you're hearing this internal monologue from Morgan Freeman as he's writing this letter, and he's talking about the importance of training a boxer, and he's like, you're doing your best to reshape and remold them. But the problem is you don't actually want them to do everything that you say, because if you do that, they're no longer really a boxer. They need to have some kind of fight left in them. And as a writers, creators, we have to toe this line of we're putting ourselves out there. Like, I just finished writing my first feature script, and going through this feedback process of getting people that you trust, or sometimes just anybody to sit and read your work long enough to form a thought. And you're going to hear people give you thoughts and ideas, and it's such a tricky job of, what do I take from this and what do I reject? Like, what? And sometimes it's a bit of a mix of the two, of, because I do a lot of client work where I'm writing scripts for clients, and they might come and say, hey, I want you to change the story, and it should be this. And you have to kind of step back and say, okay, why are they suggesting this? Is there another problem that they're trying to address that they just can't put their finger on, and it takes place 10 minutes before that ever happens? And so it becomes this very tricky game of, I need to assess the assessor in order to determine whether or not this makes sense. And so I'm curious, where did you kind of find that line? What were maybe even some of those topics? What's that process look like for you whenever you're trying to evaluate?
A good question. I mean, I think I had, when I started to feel like I needed to push back on the editor, what was really going on was that she was trying to, I felt like she was taking me away from the story I wanted to tell, which really then forces me to really think, what am I trying to say here in this story? What is my message? What is the arc that I want? I mean, there needs to be an arc, but I need to decide what that arc is, not someone else. And there were some times when I had to really resist changing things, because it needs to have more action, or it needs to have more of this or more of that. But I had to really kind of dig in and decide, well, what am I trying to say? And am I just trying to please a certain audience, or am I trying to tell a particular story regardless of what the audience ends up being? And I acknowledge my daughter's song in this regard, but it was really true. At a young age, she kind of helped me with a little bit of that. She was just like, well, Dad, you need to tell the story you want to tell, and then let the audience come to it. I mean, don't just think about, I have to do this in order to please this audience. I mean, I think that would have been a mistake for me. I had a story that I wanted to tell, and I had to figure out how I wanted to tell it. And so, in that regard, I kind of would push back on the editing, but there were certainly other editorial suggestions that I really took. And in fact, later on, another editor that I acknowledged, which was probably the best editor I had, a young woman named Erin Davis. She really took what was really a short story and a little bit rough. She took it. She really built it into the novel. She helped me build it into the novel that she's in. And I will say, one of the gifts that she had as an editor was that she was able to tell me what I needed to do, but without being specific. I mean, for instance, she would say, Kevin, your characters are too perfect. Everyone has flaws. It's human nature. People have flaws. You need to think about writing in flaws, or you need to add some detail here. Details are interesting, but she left it up to me, to do that. But she was able to give me advice in a way that left the real decision making up to me as to what the story was. She didn't tell me what the story needed to be. She was just giving me advice on how to flesh it out. And in that regard, Erin helped me probably the most of any of the editors I worked with. And she was not with the independent editors group, by the way. She was more, she worked just on her own. And I paid her, of course, on the side. She was a little bit more of a doing it as a side job for her. But she's an English literature major and has written some herself, written a novel herself. But she's actually was quite gifted in editing and did a great job with it.
That's tricky. So I feel like everyone has their own method of taking critique and like handling it. Are you I guess two parts of this is, do you prefer it to be like emailed or handwritten, or do you want to have a conversation about it? And then do you like more brutal, like honesty, or are you
Yeah.
just like, let me know the high level and save the brutality?
Yeah, I like writing because, and I like both. So I like writing, especially if it's just grammar and things, because
Mm,
I'm a very visual person, but I do like to discuss things too, especially the higher level issues I like to discuss. But I'll tell you what, and this is something early on in the process when I decided to write this short story, which ended up being a novel. I really made the decision not to be thin-skinned, and
mm,
I told myself not to be thin-skinned, um, because I tend to be. I'm a little bit of a sensitive person by nature, but I told myself that this is a learning process, and I'm not going to learn if I'm too thin-skinned, and I've tried as best I could to be open to whatever, and so sometimes editors were kind of harsh, and people who read early drafts, and I've had a couple of people read early drafts and say they didn't like it, and they had specific problems with it, and it's always a little bit hurtful, but I took it in and I don't take offense at it. I mean,
mm.
it's growth, because first of all, not everybody's going to like my writing anyway. Some, to a certain degree, it's subjective, but even so, I still learn from it, and I really made an effort to learn in that regard, and um, be open to whatever method that the editor has, or the reader has to give me feedback.
Yeah, it's just so tricky because on the one hand, you always want to hear good things about your work, but on the other hand, I'm always leery of hearing good things because you don't you can always trust a negative opinion there, because no
Yeah.
one, I think, goes out of their way just to be mean. And so I'm like, okay, this is an honest thought, but whenever you hear positive things, sometimes I'm like, okay, is this kindness or is this like how they really feel
Mm.
about what they just digested. uh,
No, I know what you mean. Yeah.
yeah. So what does your writing habits look like? Do you write every day? Are you kind of the Stephen King personality where it's like, oh, from 10 to noon, I write? Or is it more of you come up with a writing plan for the week, or are you much more loose with it?
I was very loose with it. It came in spurts. So once I made the decision to expand my very short story, 2,000 word short story, into a 10,000 word short story, it went very quickly. That part went very quickly, but it wasn't planned. I mean, I mostly would work in the evenings after work. Um, a glass of wine while I compose, and a couple of cups of coffee the next day when I'm editing, and probably twice as much editing as writing. And but over time, after some evenings and on weekends especially, just would build on it. But it wasn't very planned. It was um, almost just when I felt inspired. But my inspiration was pretty consistent. I mean, I would go for weeks and weeks and be, work quite hard on it, the writing, and but then I would take a couple of weeks off. I would take several weeks and I'd work pretty hard on it, and then it would sit a little while, and then I would go back to it, and then especially when I made the transition from the 10 to 15,000 word short story to more of a novelette or novel, 50,000 words and beyond. Um, I would take bigger breaks, but then I would go through several weeks where I was just intense on it, especially in the evenings and weekends. And because I mean, I was still had a full-time job, and I was doing that. So most of my work was in the evenings and weekends, but it wasn't very planned. I would say I would just do it when I had time to get to it.
Are you big on outlining? Is that something that, as you're looking at, okay, I'm going to write X amount of chapters, or I'm going to write, this chapter, I need to tackle these story beats, and I'm going to do it within this. Uh, yeah.
No, no. I mean, as a matter of fact, and I'm normally a fairly organized person, in drawing outlines. But when it came to this, there was a fair amount of inspiration. I will say, looking back, I would draft very rough outlines of kind of an arc of where I wanted things to go, but it would be very rough. And even then, it would just be sort of sections at a time. I never at any moment sort of outlined the entire book. I mean, I outlined sort of sections at a time as I thought about where I wanted the character to go and the story I wanted to tell.
How many, and this probably requires some definitional terms here, how many drafts would you say you wrote along the way? And then how do you define a draft?
Oh gosh,
Right.
Drafting is tough because defining a draft in itself was tough, because there was a lot of times when I thought I was done, but I wasn't, and I would have a so-called draft. I'd print it out and the whole thing, and then I would end up, it wasn't done yet, and I would work more on it. I must have 100. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate, but probably through the whole process, there must be, between 50 and 100, what I would have called drafts where it was done to the point where I didn't look at it at least for a few days before I would go back at it and review it, and and then rework it again. And there was that in itself. It's interesting that you asked that, because that in itself was a real learning experience. I think in my future writing, I probably won't have so many drafts. I mean, I think I've learned that even when I think I'm done, I'm probably not really done. And I was that way professionally too. When I drafted a patent application, I would just never be done to the paralegal would pry it out of my hands and file it at the patent office. I mean, I wanted to keep working on it until the last minute. And that's kind of how I was with this. I worked on it really up until, I let it go and published it.
That's funny. So this story in particular takes place about 100 years into the future. We kind of follow a patent attorney, Jenny Sue, and always correct any of my mispronunciations along the way here.
Sure.
I'm more of I learn by reading, much less. So there's a number of times when I've announced a word to someone, they're like, "What did you just say?" Like, yeah, Belarus, right? No, it's Belarus. I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, this takes place about 100 years into the future. And I really this is a very patient story. Because you, right off the bat, you're not starting off with like a mad scientist. Instead, it's a slow entrance, discovering this world through the eyes of a patent attorney, which, given your background, I really got strong vibes of like Michael Crichton or, Grisham, using your professional knowledge, career path to put us inside a character and into a story. And so I'm curious, like this story in particular, what inspired it? I know, starting, that's really informative that it was something that started with a short story contest. Prior, where would you say this kind of originated from?
So a couple of inspirations, partly just the thought that, what would it be like as a patent attorney to be patenting world-changing technology, in the future. But I think more deeply than that, though, I think when I started to configure the story and create it, probably like a lot of authors, there's probably some at least minor autobiographical elements. I mean, I wanted to write a story about a person who was a regular person who had faults and who had her own backstory and had issues in her life that, if anything, maybe hindered her profession or hindered her life, moving forward, and had her quirks and, feeling lonely or sad or anxious, and, build someone who had just these real life kind of qualities, but at the same time was just trudging through life. And I wanted to build a character like that, but I wanted to be in a framework of of sort of world altering things. And one early theme that I remember that I started off with is that to me, the story sort of started off as a little bit of a cautionary tale insofar as in the future, I think space, I sort of imagine space travel and technological development being a little more unsupervised, as it were, and more of a Wild West sort of situation in the world, at least when it comes to the United States, and a cautionary tale in a sense of that. At least I feel like, especially being a child of the Johnson Space Center here in Houston, and my wife even working for the Johnson Space Center, and very influenced by it. Feeling like that when it comes to these types of big technological advances, responsible governments probably should take a hand in some of these things and be involved, and exploring what can happen when governments just sort of give up interest in these things, and especially the U.S. government, and other governments may take up the mantle of space travel and even move past where the United States is technologically, and what that would look like, and is that good, is it bad? For instance, in the story, I focus a lot on India and especially China. And I know quite a lot about China because even in my work, I see technological advancement there, and observe it, and sort of a competition of American companies in the United States with technological advancement there and in other countries, and just exploring whether the consequences of that, the consequences of the United States perhaps not pursuing these things as vigorously as we did at one time. And just this morning, I don't know if you saw it, but of course Bezos just went 62 miles up, and I just saw that, and he's a private citizen. And in fact, the commentator even made a comment that there's a few things that they're doing that they're not telling NASA exactly.
Wow.
I mean, of course they're governed. They're governed by U.S. law. I mean, because they're a U.S. company, they can't, and especially these technological type of things. Any company operating in the United States, they can't just do anything with sensitive technology. But at the same time, I could envision a point where the U.S. government just sort of almost gives up on it, or loosens up on it, and it, who knows where the technology goes, and it could end up in hands that aren't so responsible, or maybe they're responsible, but it's nonetheless. It puts us behind, puts us, America, or Americans maybe behind, and so that was a lot of what I kind of wanted to explore in the story early on.
Nice, I like that a lot. I wonder, one of the things, and I was joking with Song about this. Song is your daughter, of course,
Yes.
and reading it, I was like, right or wrong, I keep imagining Song as the part of Jenny, and so I'm curious. Were there any influences where you built Jenny around, or was that just, kind of inserting yourself into the story?
Probably me almost. Is that there are some elements of Jenny are probably more autobiographical. Me, experiences growing up, and sort of attitudes maybe that I've had when I was younger, when I was her age, in my 20s, 25, 26 years old. And it was probably more autobiographical in some ways. Yeah.
So for me, this gets very, I don't know, writery, I guess, but I'm big on naming conventions. I feel like this is one of the few areas a screenwriter especially can start to have some kind of subtextual elements, and start to experiment a little bit. And I assume there were some naming conventions that you used to insert symbology, some symbolism, like John Marr seemed to be about Jenny's connection to the sea, Mar being, I think, was it Latin for the sea? And there even seemed to be some alliteration between John and Jenny. And so I'm curious, Kepler seemed to be a pretty, on the nose science reference. And so I'm curious, how do you take your naming conventions, and were there a lot of these kind of subtextual elements that you were trying to insert along the way?
I think there were some subtextual elements. Some of it, though, was really how it sounded, just how the alliteration of some of the names and how they sound and look, really. And one of the names I struggled with the most was Jenny. Her first name I stuck with from day one, but her family name I changed around a little bit. I struggled with because for political reasons. Her name is in general Chinese, but Shu, HSU, which I kind of started out with, is more Taiwanese. It's more of a Taiwanese spelling of a Chinese name. And for a while, I even worried. I'm like, maybe I should pick something more neutral, a more neutral Chinese, as opposed to something purely mainland, something that's mainland Chinese versus Taiwanese Chinese. And I went back and forth with that. But then I realized, Kevin, you're just overthinking this. And I liked the Jenny Shu. I liked the way it sounded. I really just liked the way her name sounded. And so I went back with that and stuck with it. But I struggled with it, But there weren't. And I went round and about with several people's names. I went around and about with Winkler-Swaren's name. His name I went back around quite a bit with. And in fact, his name I changed most dramatically, partly because the name I started out with, it turns out to be a very, very common name. I mean, we have satellites named after him now. And I thought, it's a little overused. The name I picked for him originally was a little overused. And so I went back and into my past. And let me say one thing about Winkler-Swaren, and for that matter, Jenny Shu, is that the world I created, I feel like is fairly diverse, but it's not in an artificial sense. I mean, in the world that I lived in, especially when I started graduate school and especially once I started professionally as a scientist and I worked as a scientist several years. I mean, that was the world I lived in. I remember clearly when I was postdocing one at Texas Southwest Medical Center in Dallas, and I sat at a table. There was a big meeting going on, and I was with 26 people. And for grins and kicks, I counted all the people, and I counted the diversity there. And there was literally 6 people at the table like me. I mean, U.S. born, Anglo-Saxon, American type of people there. And that was it. I mean, everybody else was from India, China, the Middle East, Israeli, European. I mean, there were people from all over the world. And that was the world really I worked in. And even as a patent attorney, that was the world I worked in, is a lot of Indian folks, a lot of Chinese folks, people from the Middle Eastern folks. And I very much lived in that world. And so, so the world I create in this book of, the Indian scientist and the Asian American patent attorney. I mean, it was. I didn't have to reach far for that. I mean, it was the world I lived in professionally, and so that was the world I used. And very much when you're a scientist in this country, it's a very international world because, in fact, you see it. For instance, in my neighborhood, we live very close to the Johnson Space Center, and if we literally have astronauts that live in this neighborhood. And Song got to go to school with astronaut kids, but also all the scientists and engineers that work at NASA, that work at the oil and gas industry. Somehow we have this neighborhood is very diverse in terms of internationally diverse, and she got to grow up with that too. The high school she went to was very internationally diverse school because of, I think, being close to the Johnson Space Center. So anyway, it's the world I live in as a scientist, and a patent attorney, and so that was kind of the world I created. That, if anything, kind of governed my naming, my nomenclature more than anything.
Wow. Putting together this kind of story where you're taking on obviously some pretty high-minded elements, and then even more so trying to take it on from the standpoint of a patent attorney who not only understands it, but is tasked with explaining it to people who don't understand it. I mean, there's a lot going on within that. And obviously you have experience firsthand with that idea, but I'm curious, from what kind of research goes into, writing this, or if, because it's so far into the future, you get to just have the fun of completely making things up, or piggybacking on other things that are happening right now in the science community, the techno-babble aspect of it. So I mean, even the geographic changes that you insert into the world could be rooted in something that's happening today. I mean, some things are much bigger, like unifying of Korea, which I loved. That was a really fun touch. But even within the Russian region, there's a lot going on there. So I'm curious, what kind of research, went into putting together all these ideas of what the future is going to hold?
Probably the most research I did was, you mentioned there towards the end, the researching about the region, the region around the Caspian Sea of that whole region, north of Persia and south of present day Russia, that the whole region of the world there, researching the history of that region, Chechnya and the Georgia, that region of the world. I didn't know much about that region of the world before, but some of it is, though I chose that to focus on that region of the world in part because I'm projecting from current events, but likewise I focus a lot on India and China because I'm focusing on current events. I mean, I do see them as rising technological powers in the world, and so much science and engineering going on in those two countries, and I piggyback a lot on that, and that was that was kind of a starting point, though. But that was where I did a lot of research. Was with that was sort of that region of the world. I didn't have to do. I'm pretty knowledgeable in astronomy. I'm very much self-taught in that. I majored in chemistry in school, but I very much self-taught myself in astronomy, and it's been sort of a hobby. I mean, astronomy is kind of a hobby of mine, and then likewise, being so far in the future, some things I just thought of, but still a projection. Some things, though, are more a serious projection. The state of intellectual property and patent law. I mean, for instance, the whole concept of China filing actions in an international court of law. I mean, we already do have rudimentary international courts of law for these types of things, and I project that in the future it's going to be stronger. And I project the way if China proceeds the way they're going. I mean, right now the stereotype is that China steals intellectual property, but in the future, I think it's going to almost flip on its head. I think they're going to be very strong technologically. And there's even some evidence of that currently, I think, in the intellectual property community. They very much want to take charge of their own patent world in China. And I think extraterritorially, and I could foresee a future where not only will they not be stealing, but they'll want everyone. I mean, they'll be enforcing their own intellectual property, even to the detriment maybe of everyone else. I mean, everyone else then will be like, well, hey, we want to do this, and you can't stop us from doing this and practicing this technology or that technology. And that's kind of how technology goes, especially in IP. There's a lot of overlap and people filing patents and then having to cross-license technology. And I was exploring some of that, but I think my thought is that in the future, that some of that may flip on its head. I mean, right now, the United States is very much dominant and generating intellectual property and advancement of technology, but that could change, which goes back to sort of my feelings of a kind of a warning. The book being a little bit of a warning that if we let that thing fall to the wayside, if we let technology kind of become less important, the rest of the world's not necessarily going to think it's less important. They'll think we'll end up we'll fall behind, I think. And so.
Absolutely. You have, for being a century into the future, I really loved how kind of grounded and afantastical everything really was. I mean, there's elements of progress for sure. The idea of androids and their place in our lives, and even some of the inhibitions that are placed on them, and as well as like the neural implants and some of the limiting factors with that, and even some of the social stigma around their usage. These are really fun, interesting, but also subtle concepts, and from the standpoint that we're not beaming each other, across the country, and so where do you see the state of, is that more grounded because that's where you just think everything happens a lot more slowly than we anticipate,
Yes.
or is it? Yeah.
I think it's that. My experience over the years looking at this sort of thing is that science fiction is fantastic. I mean, Gene Roddenberry essentially invented, this, really. But science fiction writers are usually well ahead of where we end up really being in reality. I mean, Arthur C. Clarke, for instance, I mean, he has these great space stations orbiting the Earth, and that's great. And I think we'll get there one day, but we weren't there in 2001, and we're still not in 2020. And I think in reality, we're always a little behind where our minds are. And so I tried to ground the story really in where it should be. And it's funny, you said, one of my editors, going back to Sally Artesteros, the second big editor, she even said herself, I struggled a little bit with what year I wanted this to be. And I started to make it around really the 2050s or so. And she said, Kevin, I can't even get people to fix a pothole in the street in my front and in my house. So I think she encouraged me to put it way in the future. I mean, her feeling was, and she is not even a science or science fiction type of person, but her feeling even was that we're way off from any of this. So put it way in the future, and I agreed with that suggestion. Actually, that was one suggestion I agreed with of hers.
Where do you think interstellar travel goes from here? Are you, I don't know, bullish on that idea? Do you think, hey, we're probably going to make some pretty amazing strides?
I am. I mean, I am. I think it's going to go. I think there will be progress. I think it'll be slow and it'll take time. I mean, but I think in the next 100, 200 years, I think that humans will achieve some slow interstellar travel and then more rapid interstellar travel. Another thing I was heavily influenced by when I was young, I mentioned that astronomy is a hobby, but I grew up with The Cosmos by Carl Sagan and watched that on PBS when it was a series, and have the book. And he talks some about the future of interstellar travel. And he didn't even talk as far as I did. I mean, his vision was, fairly slow interstellar travel, ships that would take, a generation to get from one star to another. And I definitely see that happening. I think technologically we're definitely going to get there. The biggest hindrance is going to be money. I mean, these things are terribly expensive. I think that's going to be the biggest hindrance, even just getting to Mars. I mean, my wife is all excited about getting to Mars, for instance, and Elon Musk, whenever he talks about it. And I say, it's great, but it is just so expensive. It's going to be so expensive to do that kind of thing. I think we're there already technologically, for instance, to go to Mars, but just the money it's going to take, and the fact that it's going to be almost a suicide mission. I mean, probably someone will certainly die. I mean, it's so dangerous. And those things, safety and money, are just huge hindrances to further interstellar travel. And it's just going to take time to overcome that, realistically speaking. Even technologically, if we develop things, the safety and money are just always going to be a big hindrance.
What, so in terms of where you're at, writing wise, are there any plans for a sequel or other books? Or is this something you just had to do once and now you're done? Where are you going from here?
I would like to write other books. I would like to write a sequel to this. And that is one thing I'm planning now. And I think in the future, going back to your idea of outlines, that probably now that I've been through this process once, I probably will utilize fewer drafts, more outlines, in my writing. I also have other, frankly, some of the other short stories that I wrote, they're completely non-science fiction related, other stories that I've written that I want to expand on. In fact, I've come closer really to beginning expanding one other particular short story I had, that just a general nonfiction about an attorney, that I may expand. And in that instance, it was also somewhat like this story in that I was exploring a person's personal experience. It was really more of a character-driven kind of story. And in this case, this person is struggling with anxiety and what to do with their life, and then using being an attorney as kind of a backdrop. Just like in this case, Jenny, she's struggling with some things, but her interactions with this brilliant scientist, Dr. Vincula Swarn, is kind of the backdrop, and she gets kind of carried into it. She doesn't even want it, but it happens, and she overcomes struggles and as just a regular person would.
Yeah, no, I love the progression, just not only between her and her relationship with him, but I love the progression throughout the novel because it felt so real to life in the sense that relationships come and go, friendships come and go, as you're progressing through life and through even your career. Where you're spending your time ultimately often dictates who you become close with. Just because geography is always going to be a hindrance to, maintaining relationships here and there, even when technology has grown the way it has. And so I just really appreciated that, hey, where we start, here's someone, and they grow apart, and that's okay. And their relationship evolves and changes. And so I really appreciated just the pacing and some of the tonal shifts throughout the novel to kind of reflect where she is on her path, for sure.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. Any advice for other aspiring writers? Is there anything looking back where you're like, I wish, or this would have been better, or
My first of all, and in fact, in talking to you, some of it kind of came up, but I would say as advice, don't wait till you're organized. I mean, and don't wait till you think you know what you're doing. I mean, I didn't know what I was doing initially. You just dive in and start writing. And I did that as a kid. I mean, I didn't know how to write a story, but I just wrote. And that is my biggest advice, is just write, but then ask for help from somebody who does know what they're doing, and just learn. It's an iterative process. It really is iterative. That is the first big advice, is just jump in and just write. And it's okay to, use whatever method you need to. If you like to compose with a glass of wine, like I said, and edit with a pot of coffee the next day, and do it, or however you do it. The other piece of advice is to definitely do get help, though. Get outside help. Even someone that's not a family member is especially helpful. Somebody who can give you some objective advice and give you sort of the harsh criticism, or even positive feedback where you could believe them. That's very important. And those are the two big. And the third piece of advice is simply to don't try to write for anyone else. And really, as my daughter said, I know you talked many times about the pacing of this story. That was one of my concerns about this story, I have to say, in terms of are people going to like it? I realized that this story is slow, probably. In fact, when I first wrote it, it was so slow. In fact, my daughter, when she read it, and it was just kind of a long, short story, she was like, Dad, most stories, they start off kind of slow, but then they rise and they have a climax. And then, I don't even think my story initially had a climax. It was there was no action at all. And I had to learn to build something into it to sort of pull the reader in. But I I didn't want endless loops of peril, and it's just not my thing. And so I didn't put it in there. And I think it's important to just tell the story you want to tell and tell it the way you want to tell it. And if you think, don't worry that other people aren't going to think it's exciting enough or whatever. It's, you tell the story that you want to tell.
Any other writers right now that you're excited about, whether it's Ted Chiang or Cixin Liu? I don't know how to pronounce any of their names, unfortunately, or someone else. Is there any other great sci-fi coming out right now that keeps you excited?
I'm still, these days, I haven't really read a lot of science fiction. You mentioned Ted Chiang. He was very inspirational, by the way. His writing style, he wrote the novelette that was turned into the movie Arrival.
I finished watching Arrival this morning for the umpteenth time because I had just last week read Story of Your Life for the first time, and I was like, oh my God, this changes everything.
I really liked his writing style, and I was inspired by how he wrote. And but if anything, I'm going back. In fact, I have one of the books. What is it here? And yes, I'm going back and reading. For instance, this is the Do Androids Dream Electric Sleep?
Wow.
And some of Philip K. Dick. Going back and reading some of those novels, and I'm interested in going back and reading some of that type of thing. Is I think where my focus is now.
That's so wild. Like, we're about to do both Blade Runners on my podcast, and so the first Blade Runners, where I'm going to give you a shout out and link all my tens of listeners to your work. But nice, yeah. And I've read some Philip K. Dick, but I haven't read that one actually. That should be on my list for sure.
Well, this is the book that Blade Runner is based on. Do Androids Dream Electric Sheep? And very good book. I mean, I've read some of it. It's a great book, and and of course the movie was very inspirational. I love that movie, the Blade Runner.
Nice. What any final words? Anything you wanted to touch on about your novel? I tried to keep everything high level to keep people's interest. It's about so many things, but also very, very few things. Just very deep on a very few things. Intergalactic travel and relationships and science and the insights of what it means to. I was really surprised and enjoyed seeing the level that attorneys get pulled into when it comes to negotiating some of these things and working through some of these things. And so is there anything we haven't touched on yet that you'd love to say about your novel?
One thing that I will mention, when I brought this novel up, in fact, it was with a group of people at work when I was still working, a group of attorneys. And I mentioned sort of the main character. It's a book about an attorney. One of the first things that one person said was, "Oh, what kind of superpower does she have?" And I was kind of taken aback by that question. It took me a while to even formulate an answer, but then I realized to just say, well, it's not that kind of science fiction. I mean, because obviously superpower, the DC Marvel Comics thing is very popular right now.
Mm-hmm.
I will leave by saying that my novel is not that. And I like that kind of stuff. It's great. But I wanted to tell a story about a person who's a real person, and she's a real person in the year 2100, just like we are now. And that we humans, I don't think we're going to change a whole lot. Change for us is going to be very slow. Mm-hmm. I think the story still comes down to people and human beings and how we interact with technology. That's the important thing, is not so much the technology, but how it affects us as humans and how it may change us, how we resist it. And that's what this book I tried to explore in this story, and I think that's what's important.
Awesome. Is there anywhere do you have any social media or a website that we can follow along?
Not right now.
Okay.
I am on Kindle. So on Amazon, they actually have just developed a new platform called Vela, where you can publish individual sort of excerpts of short story. You can publish a little bit at a time,
Mhm.
and I'm starting to explore publishing things on Vela, and so there's that. Otherwise, really right now, just what I have on Amazon is where I can be followed. I think I have an author's page there on Amazon, and email if people have questions for me.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll link that for sure in the notes then. Well, thank you so much. If everyone is looking for, fresh new voice science fiction, I feel like this is a great spiritual successor to Contact, which I think lines up a little bit with your Cosmos statement about Sagan earlier. It's a very patient, personal story, intimate look at someone's life as it's impacted by technology in so many ways. And so thank you so much for taking the time to hang out and talk with me.
Well, thank you, Wes. I appreciate taking the time.